All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of Art Brunch. This one is titled Wilderness, Serpents, and Saints, an Artist's Odyssey. Before introducing our contemporary artist, I want to introduce one of the influencers of that artist's latest style. This is the work of James Ensor, a late 19th and early 20th century Belgian artist. He was celebrated and defamed for his primitive, crude, goading style. Artists have often used the skeleton and the grotesque as a means of visual commentary, usually as a strong critique of ideas, culture, or society as a whole. This one is titled Skeletons Arresting Masqueraders. It seems quite crude. However, it sold at Sotheby's recently for $7.8 million. So people of the late 19th and early 20th century were impacted greatly by these confronting images. Skeletons fighting over a hanged man. Ensor is painting a part of his past as well as his present feelings. His mother had a shop which sold masks, puppets, and skeletons. So he's simply using his childhood experience within his mother's shop to express himself. He obviously is troubled by the behavior he sees within his own culture. What behavior do you suppose he is mocking? Perhaps obsession over trivial matters? Some form of hypocrisy, perhaps? What do you think? Skeletons fighting over a pickled herring. Ensor is using skeletons as a scathing commentary on human behavior. And here's his most famous work, Christ's Entry into Brussels in 1889. You probably have a difficult time even seeing Christ, but he's in the middle with a halo. James Ensor was familiar with Nietzsche's critiques of Western philosophies and religion, and he agreed with Nietzsche for the most part. And Ensor was also an atheist himself. Yet as Nietzsche struggled to deal with integrating his past, Ensor used art to deal with a tradition he initially rejected. The banner reads, Vive la sociale, or Long live the social revolution. Using masks and skeletons on those surrounding Jesus, the artist is not depicting the followers of this revolution favorably, is he? Here's a close-up of Christ's entry. Ensor may have rejected the church, but he can't release himself from Christ. Something is still attractive about this humble prophet. It's his followers and the culture that claims a Christian heritage that bother him. He's grappling with the paradox. Here's one critic's summation of the artist. Gothic fantasist, political satirist, religious visionary. One minute he's doing biblical scenes, the next the equivalent of biker tattoos in a style that veers between crude and dainty. This is a self-portrait of the artist. He is the one in the red hat, the only one without a mask-like appearance. Other well-known artists, such as Vincent van Gogh, have used skeletons, not as a statement about our mortality, but as some enigmatic expression of the living, perhaps himself. I now want to introduce the work of a contemporary artist, Michael Sharon, known best for his landscape paintings, but who recently began using the skeleton to make his own unique commentary about society, but more so about himself. But we will begin at the start of Sharon's career. When Sharon was an award-winning art student, he created provocative work using religious imagery derived from his Catholic upbringing. Gun-toting blue cherubs, for example, in this work entitled Ecclesiastical Warriors. Obviously, he was rethinking his religious tradition and reinterpreting it in a way that would disturb some. Unsurprisingly, He left religion altogether and explored other mind-altering practices. He abandoned making art for several years and fell into addiction. However, after living in the Rocky Mountain region for 2 decades and working as an art broker, Sharon abandoned drugs and alcohol, and he started painting again. This time, nothing conceptual and provocative. Packing up his llamas with food, paints, and canvases, he would trek 3 days deep into the high mountains, and over the course of weeks, would paint terrain most of us will never see, except through his paintings. It was in the rugged beauty of the American Southwest, and in expressing that beauty with his brush, that Sharon reconnected with his spiritual side. The artist wasn't entirely alone in these remote locations. He had visitors, made new friends. The artist was seeking remote scenes in the tradition of the Hudson River School painters, who came out west to introduce Easterners to the majestic beauty of the Rocky Mountains. This is Michael Sharon country, the Zirkle Wilderness in northwest Colorado. You could see how the artist could cultivate a deep spiritual life in such a landscape. The artist encountered lovely rivers containing the living water he was searching for. The artist at this time was in a groove professionally with these images, and personally, his life improved as well. He married someone he'd met through church. They took many classes on spiritual development together. And after painful experiences in life and romance, finally a relationship with a spiritual foundation. But then life seemed to punish him again. The artist was blindsided by a divorce, and he had a choice: simmer with anger and hatred, or heal. The artist tried to come to terms, sometimes to extremes, to exercise the emotions he was feeling. So he filmed himself swimming in these icy, frigid, but living waters. Aware of a bluish ceiling, he wrote, I observe my shadow on a plain below. I've forever longed to fly, and now it has come to pass. There's a double meaning in that word, shadow. All of us who have been in romantic relationships with the opposite gender have experienced the extremes of emotions. We became exasperated by the opposite gender. During a breakup, that exasperation intensifies often to anger, sometimes rage. We've seen examples from artists like Artemisia Gentileschi. Let's look at one of the most famous artists to express exasperation at the opposite sex. Seated Bather, 1930, by Pablo Picasso. When Picasso went through a romantic breakup, you knew it. He expressed it in his art. And Michael Sharon realized that nature's beauty wasn't enough to deal with the anger and the confusion. So he turned to his roots. He began exploring aspects of the Catholic tradition he thought he'd left long ago. But the results were shocking. Nude Saint with Crows and Ouroboros. This is Saint Agnes of Montepulciano. Her dates are 1268 to 1317. Let me tell you a little bit of her life story. She entered a Franciscan monastery at age 9. As a young girl, she asked her mother to go with her to visit several convents. And Agnes and her mother were passing one day a house of ill repute when a flock of crows suddenly descended upon her, pecking and scratching the little girl. Her mother remarked that the crows represented demonic forces threatened by her purity. So Agnes later founded a convent on that very spot. At age 20, she was selected to be abbess of the new convent. And there it was reported she performed many miracles. She was so pure, in fact, that flowers would grow up where she had prayed. Agnes suffered from many health issues and she died at age 49. And the Dominican friars came and attempted to obtain balsam, or maybe it was myrrh, to embalm her body. Yet her body was found to already be producing a sweet odor on its own, and her limbs remained supple. When her body was moved years after her death to the monastery church, it was found to be incorrupt. Incorruptibles are saints whose bodies decompose at a miraculously slow rate or not at all. Look at Agnes's face. It's frightening because there's still flesh on it. This is Saint Cecilia, martyred in 177 CE, the first saint whose body experienced the phenomenon of incorruption. She was a noble, young woman with renowned beauty. Her executioners who came were afraid to execute her because of her popularity with the people. So they tried to kill her in secret, but their attempts failed. An experienced executioner was then sent to behead Saint Cecilia. But due to a loss of courage at having to kill such a young and beautiful woman, he failed to sever her head with the 3 blows required by law. He ultimately fled, leaving the saint on the pavement of her bath, alive and fully conscious, with her head half severed. Saint Cecilia was lying on her right side, her hands crossed in prayer before her. She turned her face to the floor and remained praying in that position for 3 days and nights. The position of her fingers, 3 extended on her right hand and 1 on the left, were her final silent profession of faith in the Holy Trinity. Now, if you wanted an in-person view of these 2 provocative artworks, you won't find them. They've been painted over with landscapes. And here is where Saint Cecilia lies. The artist calls the underneath hidden images optical communions. And by that term, he means they are visual prayers. The gruesome, absurd depiction of long dead saints with nude, youthful figures are meant to wake us up. Like Ensor, perhaps by an element of mockery, but unlike Ensor, Sharon's saints wake us up through self-mockery. I happen to know that these works were a form of self-therapy, an attempt to courageously reveal the raw emotions that the artist experienced after a divorce, combined with a spiritual exploration of his childhood faith tradition. And friends, you cannot explore the shadow and censor the shadow at the same time. Through art, we can express the darkness creatively and thus diffuse its power to continue to harm us and others. And I also think the artist is daring himself and us to see women in a new light. Why is it okay to objectify a certain type of woman, an actress, for example, but if this woman is a saint, we are suddenly uncomfortable with objectification? In this light, such works are particularly beneficial as prods to our culture to recognize the absurdity of the games we play around gender, and perhaps help us grow beyond our facile perspective. So let us acknowledge the shock value in these works, but I believe a healthy shock value. Now, another question. Why does the artist use colored pencils and paint in an apparently primitive, naive way? Well, the artist is in a long tradition of such expression. Marc Chagall painted in this primitive style. Why? Because the artist is exploring a very deep place in the unconscious, the place where a child still lives. These are the artist's field notes taken out in the remote wilderness. They reflect how the outside world fed Sharon's inner world. One afternoon on these trips, this outward world would turn his gaze back to an inner terrain by the lesson of the caterpillar that you could see on the left. It becomes a butterfly that can fly against power winds, the artist writes. The natural world is informing the artist's spiritual world. He wants to fly again. This desire will take him on a unique spiritual journey. Sharon told me his sojourn is one of 40 days and 40 nights, symbolic of a period in the wilderness to address one's shadows, wounds, demons. And there the artist found serpents. We are familiar with the serpent from my presentations on William Blake, who used it frequently. Inasmuch as the serpent leads into the shadows, Carl Jung writes, it has the function of the anima. It leads you into the depths. It connects the above and the below. Blake has painted the serpent in gold, and that hue envelops Eve, the receiver of a secret wisdom that Adam, who once possessed both the masculine and feminine archetypes, but now no longer possesses the feminine. And that is why the feminine carries such important and profound wisdom. The feminine energy carries secret wisdom that the masculine seeks. This is a self-portrait of the artist with an Ouroboros halo. Look at the halo, a serpent biting its own tail, and in a primitive, colorful style reminiscent of Marc Chagall. Well, the Ouroboros is an image that goes way back to ancient Egypt, and it was used often in the esoteric religious traditions of medieval Europe. It has several meanings. It represents the cycle of death and rebirth, and it represents wholeness. It represents the unity of God. Again, Carl Jung says, the Ouroboros is a dramatic symbol for the integration and assimilation of the opposite, of the shadow. This feedback process is at the same time a symbol of immortality, since it is said of the Ouroboros that he slays himself and brings himself to life, fertilizes himself and gives birth to himself. He symbolizes the one who proceeds from the clash of opposites, and he therefore constitutes the secret of the Primal Material, which unquestionably stems from man's unconscious. The Primal Material refers to the primal material from which the universe was created, the clay in the hands of God. Notice the primitive style Sharon uses in this art. The serpents, brightly colored, look almost like candy a playful child artist would create in order to diffuse any threatening aspect of the serpent. Yet is the danger of the serpent completely eliminated? There's a kind of blend of both, I believe. After all, the eyes of the serpent are a menacing deep red. Unlike Ensor's skulls, which serve as a form of mockery and judgment on society, Sharon began creating skulls like this to highlight a personal exploration of his faith tradition and his own conflicted emotions with it. He calls these Catacombs Saints. Where did the idea for a catacomb saint come from? from Europe, where the Catholic tradition of saints began. This is an altar in a catacomb in Poland, filled with bones. And the bejeweled saint? Well, at yearly festivals, these bejeweled saints are paraded around European villages. Michael Sharon's art is simply celebrating that tradition. Yet the artist has to reflect our contemporary experience as well, so he includes a pandemic mask in this work. Whereas Ensor's fighting skeletons are a kind of mockery of human existence, Sharon's have a more dignified view, acknowledging, perhaps begrudgingly, that the Catholic faith has been formative, not only in the artist's take on life in the world, but ours in the West as well, whether we were raised in a religious environment or not. Encased and attached below the skulls, Sharon began placing reliquaries. These are encased clear tombs made of resin which house bones, crucifixes, vials of holy water and holy oil, and occasionally blood. The reliquary is attached now to the Catacombs Saint and now informs the image of the saint. And we, the viewers, religious or not, are brought into a strange and complex world. In this reliquary, the artist's fascination with the accoutrements of a religious person is growing, becoming more expressive. The emotional charge with a difficult religious tradition has vanished. Now his saints, as bejeweled skulls, become invitations for us to explore fully this strange and complex religious tradition. This artist, who gave up his faith and his art for nearly 2 decades while feeding an addiction, has become a mystic. Let me tell you a story the artist told me. As he was pouring resin and developing a reliquary, he used a round metal pendant he got from his mom. Inside the pendant was a piece of fabric and a tiny piece of human remains, and a statement that this was a relic of Saint Sebastian. Long after the resin had dried, and despite these items being sealed inside the pendant, they mysteriously vanished. No other items inside the reliquary disappeared, just those relics. No items have ever disappeared from any of his reliquaries. And the artist wonders if this strange event, he can't explain otherwise, validates that Saint Sebastian's relics were truly authentic. Pablo Picasso said of fellow artist and sometimes rival Marc Chagall, "I don't know where he gets those images. He must have an angel in his head." Looking at Sharon's serpents, saints, and reliquaries, we are left to ask, what sort of angel is in his head? Is it an angel of darkness from the shadows, or an angel of light? Perhaps both.